Hi, I'm Mike Beliveau, and today I'd like to talk to you about powder horns. I think for those of us who enjoy 18th century living history, whether it's reenacting or shooting at rendezvous or doing living history, powder horns are probably the second most popular piece of material culture that we have behind our flintlock rifles. And today I'd like to discuss them. I'd like to tell you a little bit of the history of powder horns, when they were popular, and the different types of them. Now, I'm not going to talk to you about how to make a powder horn. I've done that, been there, done that, got the t-shirt, never going to do it again. Because there are just a lot of people who are really talented at it, and I'm not. And I'm going to show you some of their work today, along with a bunch of originals. So, first let's go back and take a look at the history of powder horns. Because horn as a material goes back a long way in terms of its use. In fact, horn has been called the plastic of the pre-industrial world, and for good reason. So in the ancient world and in the Middle Ages, a lot of things were made out of horn. Window panes, lantern panes were made out of horn because a lot of horn was translucent if you scraped it thin enough. Not all horn, which is something that most people don't understand, but certain types of horns, they can be scraped thin enough to show a lot of light. And that was a less expensive option than very expensive glass during the Middle Ages. But besides that, they made a lot of different items. Now I'm going to show you some of John DeWalt's items that he made when he became a master horner. When you're in the Honorable Company of Horners, which is the modern horn guild, to go from the journeyman level to the master level, you have to make a series of masterpieces, just as you would have done in a medieval guild. And these are some of John's. And as you can see, you can make most anything out of horn, and they did. But, maybe a little surprisingly, very few powder containers were made out of horn in the early days of firearms. In fact, a lot of them were made out of wood or metal. But if we go back to the earliest musketeers, they carried their charges in wooden bottles, called charges, generally on a bandolier that they wore over their shoulder, and there were usually 6 on the front and 6 on the back, so the charges were called the 12 Apostles. And we've got excellent examples of these that remain from the 17th century and some from the 15th century. So we know that's what they used. But they also use flasks. And I'm going to show you this flask, which is a 16th century flask from Central Europe and made with wood and metal. And these were very popular. Some of them were quite ornate. And in fact, in contemporary circles, the Fluke brothers are masters at making European-style flasks out of wood, antler, and bone. And we're going to take a look at some of their work right now because it's really spectacular. And this would have been the very highest end of work that you would have seen in Europe in anywhere from the 16th through the 18th centuries. As we get into the 18th century, in America particularly, though to a certain extent in Europe as well, horns really were the predominant container. I mean, there were flasks, but horns were very much available everywhere. They did the job very well, and they became the most common watertight powder carrier here on the North American continent. And there really are 2 types of horns. There are homemade horns, entirely homemade horns, and we've got an example of that I'll be showing you right now. This horn was made by Joseph Cram, and he made it in Hampton Falls, New Hampshire, in the year 1764. And it's a fine example of a homemade powder horn. And there are professionally made horns, and though you might not think it, the professionally made horns were really the more common variety. Now some of these were made by farmers who did it as a sideline, and others were made in what you might call a factory setting, or at least a workshop setting, where that's what they did primarily. And the reason for that is because to make a good horn, you needed some equipment. And one thing you needed was a lathe, because you had to turn a lot of the fittings, shall we say, in the horn itself, if you wanted to have a good quality horn. And you had to have facilities for boiling in hot oil, and to be able to shape them, you needed presses, you needed forms, you needed a lot of specialty goods to make a high quality horn. Now you could make a horn, and you could struggle through it yourself, and some people did because they didn't want to spend the money, or they happened to have enough skills to do that. But predominantly, horns were made commercially. Now, as an example, this horn was made in the 1770s in a commercial workshop in York County, Pennsylvania, not far from where I live right now. And quite a few horns were made here in Pennsylvania, in Philadelphia and in York. Both of those were centers of horn making. And during the French and Indian War, a lot of them were procured by provincial governments to issue to their troops, because a lot of the provincial troops did not use cartridges. They were encouraged to show up with the arms they had. They got a bounty for bringing their own guns, because often there were not enough muskets in provincial armories to outfit the provincial troops. So anybody who could bring their own gun, shot pouch, blankets, they would get additional money. So that was an incentive to do that. But the colonial governments bought a lot of horns and issued them to a lot of guys, and really kind of started a horn revolution in decoration. We'll talk about that in a little while. But the factory-made horns were the most common. And as I said, by the time we get to the 18th century, horns are it. And we're starting to see decorated horns. And we're going to take a look at some of the horns from early in the century. Well, this Chief Pogus horn has an interesting story behind it. Pogus was the war chief of the Pequawket Indians. They're part of the Abenaki Confederacy. And they were engaged in a war, essentially, with Massachusetts, which really controlled all of northern New England at that time, from 1724 to 1725, because after Queen Anne's War wrapped up, the Abenakis did not put down the hatchet, because they were not a party to the Treaty of Utrecht, and they didn't consider themselves at peace with the Bostonnais, who were trying to steal their land. So there were raids going back and forth, and a fellow named John Lovell, or Lovewell, but I believe he pronounced it Lovell, he formed a party of rangers, and rangers is probably a kind term, because they're actually scalp hunters. That was a financial incentive for them. The governor of Massachusetts had instituted a bounty on Abenaki scalps, and you could make a living doing that. And Lovell led two very successful parties into northern New England, into the New Hampshire and eastern Maine wilderness, against the Abenakis, strictly for the purposes of harvesting scalps, which he did. And he turned a profit on his first two ventures. And because of that, he was urged to go out for a third time. And that was the problem, because the men that he had led on the first two expeditions didn't want to go back out. They wanted to take a break, spend their money, see their families. So he had to recruit other men, and he got really the second tier for a lot of the guys that he took out, and a smaller party than usual. But they pushed into Maine, and they were in the valley of the Saco River, and they located an Indian camp. And they were getting ready to attack it. So they had left all their packs behind under a guard, and they were creeping up on an Indian camp. As it turned out, Pogus was returning from a raid with about 80 warriors, which is about 3 times what Lovell had, because he had had to leave men at various garrisons. So they found his track, and it took them to his baggage, and from there they got out and they formed an ambush to catch him. And a battle ensued, and Lovell ended up dying fairly soon in it. And a young ensign named Chamberlain took up the fight, and they fought hot and heavy trying to retreat back to their bags and ultimately back to a stockade they had built to hold some of their sick people. And Pogus pressed them the whole way, and Pogus was killed in the fight. And there are some interesting stories about that, as to whether Chamberlain killed him or somebody else. That he was in a reloading speed duel with one of the Rangers. They had both shot and had empty guns and saw each other, and were both trying to get reloaded, and the Ranger reloaded faster and shot Pogus. And the remnants of Lovell's Ranger Company managed to get out and get back to Boston, but it was obviously not a very successful trip for them. And Lovell's fight became kind of a staple of New England folklore for the next couple of hundred years. I think it's probably largely forgotten now, but in the 19th century, it was still a big deal. So this is Chief Pogus's horn. It was made prior to 1825. We know that because he was dead by 1825. And it was passed down, probably in his family, for some time. And looks like it was actively used after his death. But it's an interesting set of folk motifs carved on it. And it's just a neat early horn. Folk motifs were very popular on these early horns. And by early, I mean prior to the French and Indian War. So we've got another horn, the William Rawhorn, which is another lovely horn. And this is carved with hex symbols and animals and various folk motifs. And it's a fine example of an early horn. Now, I like these early horns, and I wanted one to go with my Edward Marshall rifle, which would have been in the early 1750s. So I had Tim Sanner put one together, and he made me this beautiful horn. And this has some interesting folk motifs on it. The upper third of the horn, it's a creamy translucent brown. The main body of the horn is kind of the color of tea-soaked ivory. And there's a central figure, Scrimshad, on the horn. And if you look at it, you'll see it's a double-headed eagle with a laced heart. So you can see that the central design is a double-headed eagle inside of a laced heart. And that has symbolism in Pennsylvania Dutch folklore. And it symbolizes strength and courage in marriage. So kind of a beautiful motif. Well, as we get into the 1750s, we're into the golden age of scrimshad or engraved powderhorns. And that era really only lasts through the French and Indian War and up through the War of American Independence, or Revolutionary War. After that, it begins to die out, and by 1812, it's pretty much gone entirely, with just a few exceptions that I'll talk about later. But while it lasted, it was absolutely the way to go. In fact, it was almost de rigueur to have an engraved powderhorn. And soldiers would do their own, well, particularly if they were stuck in garrison duty for some time. But there were also people who did them professionally. And a number of officers had professional horns done up. And in fact, officers competed with each other to have the nicest powder horn, believe it or not. That was a real thing during the French and Indian War. So there's some varieties of powder horn, some common motifs, and I'm just going to take you through a few of those. One of the most popular motifs for horns during the French and Indian War, and later, but particularly during the war, were map horns. And we see these constantly across the country. So we've got an example here from New York State, and another example from North Carolina at the other end of the eastern seaboard. Now, I wanted a map horn for one of my later guns. And I had Tim Sanner build this horn. And this shows all of the forts on Forbes Trail, or Forbes Road, which is the expedition against the French Fort Duquesne in 1757. Excuse me, 1758. So this horn was inspired by the map horns from the Forbes expedition, which was the expedition that went across Pennsylvania to take Fort Duquesne from the French, right, and ended up building Forbes Road and the forts on Forbes Road, which is what this map horn is all about. And because I live in Pennsylvania, it's quite meaningful to me. So it's just an example, a modern example of a very common type of horn. Now, closely associated with the map horns are a category of horn that I call commemorative horns. And these generally commemorate a battle or a campaign. This one commemorates the Battle of Quebec in 1759, and it's a professionally engraved horn and an excellent example. But there were lots of examples of these as well. Well, then there's a subcategory, and you'll find these on all of the other types I mentioned. And there are other types of horns as well. There are types of horns that are just purely pictorial, that have soldiers in battle scenes. There are all sorts of other types of horns besides these that I've laid out that seem to have a common motif. But you'll find a lot of powder horns that have the name of the owner engraved on them. You know, like M. Beliveau, his horn. And we see that on all types. It was very common. For instance, this example belonged to Pat Walsh. He was an ensign who served at Fort Edwards, New York in 1757. Well, not all powder horns were engraved. And there were actually types of horn construction, some of which might be engraved and some of which might not, that come up all the time. So you might have the integral tip horn, where everything is made out of one piece of horn. But there are actually some specialty items, and they were quite popular. So we've got the screw-tipped horns, and they were a specialty of Philadelphia, though you find them all over the place, particularly Philadelphia and points south. But Philadelphia was known for its screw-tipped horns. And in that case, the horn ends at a turned, threaded hole, and then a bone, generally bone or antler, piece is turned and threaded to screw onto the horn and provide the tip, a separate tip. And you can screw it off and fill the horn with powder very easily, which is very, very great. In fact, I had one of those. I gave it to my son when I set him up for flintlock hunting. So I kind of miss that. But there were the Philadelphia screw tips. The other very common style was a pin tip of horn. And instead of screwing off, it was permanently attached. But the tip was made out of a separate material, usually bone or antler. They were turned on a lathe and fitted on the horn and then pinned in place. The other type that we see quite often is a southern type, generally, and it's called the banded horn. And that's where separate pieces of horn were turned to groove them, fit them, and then they were fitted on the outside of a horn to provide this banding effect. And sometimes they were just a friction fit, and other times they were actually pinned to the horn. But these were quite common in the South. And they're very popular with collectors today. As I told you, by the War of 1812, engraved powder horns were pretty much out of fashion. Powder horns were back to being plain. The mountain men often used bison horn, black horns. But there are exceptions, and probably the most notable one is the Tansel family of Kentucky. And in 1798, Francis Tansel migrated west, and he settled near Georgetown in Scott County, Kentucky. So Francis Tansel was a farmer, but he made powder horns to supplement his income. And they were beautiful. He carried on the 18th century tradition of engraving his powder horns. And his sons carried on the tradition beyond his life. So we have these beautiful engraved powder horns that look very much like 18th century horns that continue on really into the mid-19th century. Tansel horns are recognized because they almost always show a federal eagle with spread wings and a shield on its breast holding arrows and an olive branch in its claws. So they have other common themes on the Tansel horns, but the federal eagle is almost always there. And they're quite distinctive and they're beautiful. Well, today we are lucky to really have a resurgence in the popularity of powder horns and in the widespread availability of beautifully engraved powder horns, because there are a lot of professional horners working today, and many of them are in the Honorable Company of Horners, which is the Horn Makers Guild, and they have a system for rating their horners, right, from apprentices to journeymen to masters. And basically they're an organization that shares the knowledge of horn making and tries to perpetuate that. And we all benefit from that, because there are so many beautiful horns on the market today. And you know, if you wanted to buy an excellent handmade long rifle, you'll be spending several $1,000s, and that's at the low end. But if you want to buy a beautiful handmade powder horn, well, you might be spending a few $100s. And it can go up from there, but for $200 you can often get a very nice powder horn, and for $300 you can get an excellent one. So they are much more affordable, and you can actually afford to collect a few of them. I like to have a horn for each granulation of powder. So I have a horn for 1.5F powder, I have a horn for 2F powder, and I have a horn for 3F powder that are all quite nice. So you can get beautifully scrimshaded horns and not spend a ton of money. If $200 or $300 is still outside of your comfort zone, and I can totally understand that, these days you can actually get a pretty nice production horn. Now most of these horns are made in India, but you can get much nicer ones than you could in days past, where they look pretty raw. Now you can get them so that you would not be ashamed to carry it around. And if you are artistic enough, just like the soldiers of old, you can apply your own engraving to it. Right? They make a pretty good base for that. So a horn like this costs about $80. Not a giveaway price, but you know, well within the affordable range for most reenactors. And it absolutely looks authentic to the period. This one came, I think, from Track of the Wolf. I've had it for quite a while. So anyway, that is my look at horns. I hope you found it informative and entertaining. If you did, you know the drill. Give it a big thumbs up. I appreciate that. It helps us beat the algorithm and get it out there in front of more eyeballs, which is always good. If you're not a subscriber and you like this kind of content, well, I recommend you hit that subscribe button, because we come out with this stuff every week, and you know, hopefully you'll enjoy all of it. So hit that subscribe button right now. And if you want to support us on Patreon, I've got the links down below, and we appreciate that. This video is probably running with ads, but a lot of my videos, a lot of them, get demonetized because of the type of firearms content. I mean, amazingly, YouTube considers, you know, filing the sights down to adjust them on a flintlock rifle to be the same level as converting an AR-15 from semi-auto to full auto, right? That's modifying a firearm, and they'll demonetize stuff like that. It's just crazy. So in order for me to keep bringing this kind of content, I like to say I just do this for love, and I do love doing it. And if I never made a dime off of it, I'd probably keep doing it, but I would not be able to do nearly as much of it. I just simply could not afford to pull a lot of this stuff together. That's just a fact of life. So if you want to support us on Patreon, it's a big help, because we're often not making the kind of ad revenue that I made, say, 6 or 8 years ago on YouTube before they implemented all their woke community standards. So if you do that, we appreciate it. Also, we got MikeBeliveau.com with other black powder content out there. It's my website, so pay that a visit. And there's plenty of stuff to read and to look at, videos to see, so I hope you enjoy it. And I'll be back at you next week. Until then, bye.